Welcome back to another whiteboard chat, and today we are going to talk about cortisol. So I've talked about cortisol in other videos. We had the adrenal insufficiency video, the spotting stress and lab work video, had the, what else did we have? Inflammation videos, probably mentioned there, and potentially another one or two videos. So it's a, it's a hormone that gets talked about constantly. It's good, it's bad, it's somewhere in between, don't really know, whatever, right? So it is good, and it's also bad. It kind of depends on the situation. It kind of depends on if it's acute versus chronic release of cortisol. So there's a lot of things to consider. The goal here is I want you to understand what it is, what it does, good and bad, and also the difference between acute and chronic cortisol release. And so maybe you can sort through some of the information out there for yourself and not necessarily freak out when you hear the word cortisol, but you may potentially be someone that does need to worry about cortisol. So again, hopefully this sheds some light on the context of your situation. Okay? So I kind of like to start with feedback loop here. So you'll see, as with most of the hormones and things that we've talked about, it's not just as simple as release cortisol. Why? I don't know. It's overly complicated, but here we are. So we start with, in the hypothalamus, we get corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. Then we get to the pituitary gland. Most of you are familiar with the pituitary gland, right? Then we get adrenocorticotropic hormone. Might have missed a syllable in there somewhere, but anywho, we get down to the adrenal glands, which again, most of you are familiar with, and that's what most people associate cortisol release with, and they are right, because now we're getting cortisol. Now, this is just in a baseline situation. So let's say we're going about our day, nothing's really, everything's going pretty normally, we're just doing our tasks, not really overly stressed. We're going to still have some cortisol release, and especially at certain times of the day, because cortisol is a circadian hormone. But we're going to get this, it's going to come back up. So signaling back to the hypothalamus, it's going to tell our body how much we need. So think of thyroid or testosterone, or those things that we talked about when we showed feedback loops for. It's going to signal back to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is in return going to respond to that signal in terms of how much cortisol we have, and it's going to determine how much more or less that we need to release, right? Now, we also have situations that will cause us to release cortisol, right? Any stressor, whether it's psychological, physical, emotional, which that's kind of psychological, any type of stress will potentially cause cortisol release, along with, adrenaline and alter other neurotransmitters that are going to affect mood and alertness and just different variables based on what the stressor is and what our body needs. So our body has a very cool support system when it comes to stress. But if you remember the adrenal insufficiency video, if we abuse that too long, well, we could end up in that kind of situation. Or kind of prior to that really burnt out state, you may just end up in a heightened cortisol state where, obviously there are other negatives, and I'll kind of talk about why that happens as well, okay? Or what those negatives might be. So that's cortisol. That's kind of how it works in a perfect world, right? But as we know, there are stressors in life. We also weight train. We also potentially do cardio, or other types of training. So there's going to be more potential for cortisol release. All right. And don't mind my blinds moving back here. My cat joined the video, so get out of the way. All right. So most cells have cortisol receptors. And the reason I mentioned that is because you're going to have there's going to be different impact of cortisol in different parts of the body, depending on what kind of receptors it's attaching to, right? So, you're going to get a different result of cortisol at a receptor site in your muscle tissue versus in your inflammation response to a joint or something, right? It's not necessarily going to be the same. Okay, so other things that it affects: blood sugar. Yep. Well, a lot of people know that, right? Cortisol release will often come with a heightened blood sugar release endogenously. Okay, we see people that, and I'm actually going to kind of mention these two together. So before I talk about that more, we'll say metabolism. So you can find research on it, research showing, I've seen different figures, and I'm sure it really varies, but adrenal insufficiency or cortisol withdrawal, I believe the cortisol, we're showing cortisol like close to zero, was showing about a 10% decrease in basal energy expenditure. Also, it actually showed enhanced glucose oxidation, but lowered endogenous glucose release. So what that means is if you take someone with adrenal insufficiency, that's part of the reason that they see low blood sugars a lot of the time. You take someone with high cortisol or high release of adrenal hormones on a regular basis, that's why you may see high blood sugar in these stressed individuals, right? So that's kind of what you're seeing there. And there's also some of that energy expenditure part, it kind of depends on other movement variables too. There is some research looking at like muscle loss and weight loss and stuff with adrenal insufficiency versus potentially weight gain for heightened cortisol. Now, a lot of that also depends on appetite and energy levels. So a person with heightened cortisol levels isn't necessarily going to be as tired. They may potentially be tired because they're stressed, but they're probably not going to be as tired as someone with adrenal insufficiency that's completely bottomed out. So a person with adrenal insufficiency may potentially have lower appetite signaling as well. Okay, so, person with heightened cortisol may have increased appetite signaling and cravings and things like that. So, they obviously have more possibility for weight gain or fat gain. So I'm going to skip out of order too, because we talked about, I mentioned fat gain, so I feel we can just go over here. So fat storage, cortisol makes you fat. No, but chronically it could potentially increase your susceptibility to fat storage. Now, it's actually completely opposite initially, because it's mobilizing fat, right? Mobilizing fat, mobilizing glucose, mobilizing these things. And why? It's because it's for energy, right? It's because we have a stressor. Our body is mobilizing these energy substrates, so we have something to burn and use for the stressor. Now, does that happen regardless of the stressor? Yeah, pretty much. So my point there is that that's going to happen potentially for exercise, you might burn these things, but it's also going to happen for have a really bad day sitting in traffic after work and you're pissed off and you're screaming at the traffic. Well, that's still happening. It's still happening. What do you think is going to happen? Well, are you going to utilize those energy substrates? Probably not, right? And then, of course, I talked about the differences in potentially basal energy expenditure and appetite, right? And sugar release and so on and so forth. So I often see definite differences in tendencies, like in terms of body composition with people with high cortisol versus people with very low cortisol, insufficiency, and fat storage patterns, potentially, also blood sugars, absolutely. I mean, I've posted on my social media more than one case of people where we put such an extreme focus on stress, and they basically went from a diabetic state down to a normal state simply from correcting stress, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, also correcting, type of like overtraining, which that's physical stress, also correcting, dietary things and sleep and so on and so forth. And yeah, I've seen people Couple examples of people dropping anywhere from like 50 to 60 points on their fasting glucose in particular, which is just incredible. That's like, I mean, that's seems like a huge number, like it's almost not even possible to drop that much, but I have, you know, screenshots of it happening, and it's definitely can happen. So people, if you see high blood glucose, you know, that's one of the things I talk about. And I've even had diabetics, you know, that are very stressed, like in earlier stages of diabetes, or even moderate stages of diabetes, and they, and you know, stress reduction makes a huge difference on their blood sugar, and then subsequently their insulin needs, right? So, you know, it's huge, and cortisol plays a huge factor in that. All right. Inflammation. If anyone remembers the inflammation video I talked about, I think I talked about cortisol in there, but yeah, cortisol and cortisone are kind of partners there in terms of inflammatory response. So a lot of times stressors do come with inflammation, and there is a cortisol response, and it interacts with cytokines. People have heard of cytokines. I'm pretty sure, again, that was in the inflammation video. That's one of the major inflammatory factors that it's going to interact with. This is why I mentioned it. But it does have a function in inflammation and immune function, which mean those two kind of go hand in hand. Memory formation. Did I put formulation? We'll say formulation. I don't know. We'll call it formulation or formation. Sorry about that. But yeah, so it's going to play a role in that simply because of its interaction with neurotransmitters and with the brain, right? So, yep, it is an important factor there. And funny enough, it is an important factor in fetus formation in pregnant females, and kind of for that same reason, it is a really important hormone. Very important hormone in the right dose, right? In the right dose. Water balance. It will interact with aldosterone levels. That's why if you're very stressed, you might hold water. Or people will have adrenal insufficiency, very low cortisol, might have very low amount of body water. It might actually end up having low blood pressure because of it, or they have low blood pressure also because of like lower resting heart rate and all that. But the water balance is part of it. People that have high blood pressure may know that diuretics are sometimes one of the medications that are used, or a diuretic may be used in combination with like a ACE inhibitor or an ARB or whatever type of blood pressure medication their doctor has them on. And yeah, so it's going to help shed some of that water. But a lot of that comes from stress. Again, like I've had multiple people with blood pressure issues, and we get their stress fixed and their blood pressure goes down, or their water retention goes down. And that is not just their environmental stressors like I'm talking about. That could be their nutrition too. It could be that they're eating a highly inflammatory diet and their digestion isn't good. And they have a lot of systemic inflammation internally. And again, right here, right? Well, we need that, right? We need that cortisol there to an extent. But again, it's going to start having negative effects of the blood pressure, of the blood sugars. At some point, you can't just chronically release cortisol over and over again. And mood disorders, question mark. Well, my question mark is, does it affect mood disorders? And yes, it absolutely does. People that are chronically stressed will potentially experience depletion of neurotransmitters, and they just simply can't keep up with demands. You know, I've had like a really long history of mood disorders and depression myself. I've done a lot of research on this, and funny enough, I had some adrenal insufficiency issues, as a lot of you know. Did I have those issues on and off for other periods of my life? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not really sure. But it may have played a role. But yeah, serotonin especially is one that can get very depleted, and also dopamine levels. I mean, I'll give you an example. If we look at, if anyone's ever seen the results of a Dutch test, There is an organic acids test at the end. It's all the way at the bottom, the oats test, and you'll see different metabolites in the urine for these different organic acids and for these neurotransmitters, dopamine and so forth. And yeah, a lot of the time when I see people that have cortisol that's all whacked out, adrenal function that's all whacked out, their organic acid test does not look good. They may have, discrepancies in that. They may also have discrepancies in methylation. They may also have discrepancies in high oxidative stress. So again, this chronic release of cortisol is going to be stressful on so many fronts, and then eventually you're going to feel the consequences by just feeling like shit, not performing well, having skewed appetite, potentially seeing these other physical or these other like quantitative parameters like blood pressure and blood glucose, and then it may be potentially end up with mood disorders, and there's just so many things that can potentially happen with chronic cortisol, chronic heightened cortisol, or chronic heightened cortisol that ends up bottoming, right? So that's cortisol. I mean, that's cortisol in a nutshell. I could talk about cortisol for hours, but that's really the main features and what's relevant to most people and what's relevant to your situation. So I hope a couple people in there at least see the video, and they may be struggling with some stress, and then maybe mood disorders as well, or they have high blood pressure, they have blood sugar that's messed up, or they have a lot of inflammation, or they have water balance issues, or they're having issues with their pregnant mother, and they're having issues with their unborn child even, so yeah, it's important. Don't try to smash it, but try to balance it. Cortisol is important to have, and it's important not to have too much of. So it can be delicate. Your body is very smart at balancing these hormones. So if you can just let it relax and be in a parasympathetic state enough, your body will do its job. You're not going to be able to just simply take a supplement to outrun chronic adrenal dysfunction or chronic dysfunction in cortisol levels. So I hope that video is helpful to at least a few people, and we'll talk to you next time.